Thank you very much for inviting me. It is sort of a challenging task to be the first speaker to kind of bring you out of that sort of vacation mode that we were in on the boat and kind of bring us back down to reality here. So, that is my task. It's a sad one, but nevertheless, I'm going to try to do a good job doing it. Yes, I'm going to talk about the global economic environment based on the economic outlook that we delivered just yesterday, and then put Sweden's challenges in that context. So here's our roadmap. It also is a good summary of what it is that's going to come out of the discussion here. The global outlook, frankly, is not a good one. We see a growth rate of 3% for this year, which is the same as it was for last year, and only increasing to 3.3 for the year 2017. That is also in the context of significant risks. We can talk about Brexit if you want, but we also don't have to. We're going to talk a lot about productivity growth and inequality and why those matter from a longer-term context. They matter in the short term, but they actually are even more important when we think about the long-term context. Now, Sweden does have some, in that background, Sweden is a bright spot in terms of the growth and in terms of labor force participation, in terms of policy undertakings here in Sweden. You get good marks for all of those things. On the other hand, there are a number of challenges that remain in the Swedish context. The labor market is the most obvious one, but it has implications, again, through the context of productivity, which has a longer-term issue. And then I think that there's clearly housing is a thread that has both macroeconomic vulnerabilities as well as implications for labor market matching and therefore for productivity growth. So that is really, I think, a key area of challenge. So this is our picture of global GDP and then in the Swedish context. So we've got our forecast here for the non-OECD in blue, the OECD in the dark line at the bottom, and then the global economy in green. And as I said, for the global economy in green, we're looking at 3% for this year and 3.3 for next year. That's in comparison to a 4% rate of growth in the global economy if we go back through the 80s, 90s, and up to the present. So 4% is a much more closer to a cruising speed or the speed of an economy in the global context that is going to be able to make good on promises to citizens. And I'm going to be very explicit about what promises I'm talking about in terms of what it is that policymakers really need to be doing in order to improve the potential output for and potential foundations for economic well-being and for social well-being when we think about the citizens of an economy. Now, Sweden is the red there, and you can see that Sweden's, you can say it's more cyclical or it's more volatile in terms of GDP growth, and that actually also is a theme that differentiates Sweden from other economies on the economic aggregates that we're going to look at. Sweden is more adjustable and does and has had a lot more adjustments or adjustment capabilities in its labor markets, in its policies, in its housing, and also in its productivity. And that last one's actually a bad one. And so in that context of a background of flexibility, I think that is where we need to be thinking about going forward about how to deal with the challenges that are most salient in the Swedish economy right now, which is with regard to the labor markets. So the underpinnings of the slow growth around the world, there are two underpinnings of that slow rate of growth, that basically flatlining at 3%, basically the lowest since the financial crisis. The two underpinnings are slow trade growth and slow investment growth. Well, here's a picture of the slow trade growth. And looking at the far set of bars there, you'll see how much global trade growth has declined from the pre-crisis decade in blue to where we are now. Now, 7% versus 3% in terms of global trade growth, is that such a big deal? It is a big deal for a couple different reasons. First, trade as an engine of growth for the global economy has been an important factor for emerging markets to be able to raise their populaces from a low level of economic well-being to a much higher level. And when we look at the numbers for the emerging markets, back only 5 or 7 years ago, it would only take 10 years in order to double living standards in the emerging markets. At the rate of growth that we're talking about now for our projections, it's double that amount of time, 20 years. And so that has big implications for what we think about as the overall climate in the global economy, and it has implications not only for the emerging market policymakers, but also for the policymakers in the advanced countries, given that we have a lot of labor market migration now. The other reason for why this step down from a 7% growth to a 2% growth, a 3% growth, is when we have much lower rates of growth of trade, we also see that that has negative implications for productivity growth. Trade is the way in which we get new ideas across borders, the way we get new management being installed in companies, the way we get new processes involved, new people merging together in teams. And so when we see this kind of decline in trade growth, we also, that's a recipe for having a deterioration in productivity growth. And again, productivity growth is a key underpinning for long-term sustainability in economies and the long-term capacity of an economy to make good on its commitments to its citizens. Now, the centerpiece of the slowdown in trade in the most recent period, 2015-2017, including our projection period, it's all about Asia. That's centered on China. And so to the extent that Sweden's trade only, you can say, well, only 20% of the trade is with the emerging markets. Well, that's still a big number, a big share. Now, looking at the bars on the on the left-hand side, the U.S. and the euro area, a lot of trade between Sweden and the euro area, and so we can say that there's some counterbalancing here. Trade in the emerging markets and in Asia is contracting, deteriorating. On the other hand, trade in the euro area is rising in terms of rate of growth. So how that's going to balance out in terms of Sweden's trade, we will have to see going forward. But again, we have to think about the trade in the context of capacity to double living standards and improve livelihoods in the emerging markets, and following on from that, labor market migration. And then the second piece is how does declining in trade affect productivity growth? So turning to labor markets, which is sort of the manifestation of where we are in terms of growth rate, there's sort of good news and bad news here. Looking at unemployment rates, the good on the left-hand panel, Sweden there is in red, and you can see that Sweden is one of the few countries that has retained the same or attained the same unemployment rate in the current period, 2016 Q1, which is the bar, as was the case in 2006. And you can see that for many other of the countries further on in the diagram within the euro area and the euro area as a whole, the EA here, that in fact for those countries, they have not yet achieved the unemployment rate that they had prior to the crisis. So the labor unemployment rate in Sweden has healed by this metric, whereas in many countries in the neighborhood, that has not been the case. Now that's one lens on the labor market healing. The other lens is the employment rate, which is this one here. And Sweden is up at the top with the highest employment rate. And the other thing to look at is that not only is it a high employment rate, but it is higher now in 2016 than it was back in 2000. So the employment rate, bringing people into the working, this is working age population as a denominator. So it's not just those who are attached, but it's the working age population, everybody who could work. The employment rate this is a very good indicator for Sweden, and it differentiates Sweden from some other countries that often are put forward as having good labor markets. The United States, for example, which is in the blue line, even though the unemployment rate in the United States is quite low, if we look at the employment rate, you can see that there's been a decline from 2000 to where we are in 2006. An uptick since the financial crisis, of course, but an overall trending down, represented in other terms by a declining labor force participation rate. So from a couple of different metrics, the way we look at the labor markets, Sweden is in better shape than other comparators, and certainly in better shape than the euro area, which is down at the bottom. Not only does it have a low share of the working age population actually employed, but in fact, by the end of 2016, it hasn't even reattained where they were in 2008 prior to the financial crisis. So good news for Sweden according to these metrics. Now, when I said that there was this 3% rate of growth in the global economy, less than 2% for the advanced economies, I said that that was a lot lower than the cruising speed of the global economy of 4%. Now, I've called this a low growth trap. The argument being that businesses' investment is quite low, and we'll see a picture of that in a minute. Business investment is quite low. Therefore, job creation and wage generation is low, which means that consumption growth rates are low, which means that businesses don't see any reason to invest. So it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is a self-fulfilling negative feedback loop, and so we are stuck at a low rate of growth of 3%. What are the consequences of that low growth trap when we think about these longer-term trends of productivity and inequality? The first consequences of a low growth trap, particularly thinking about the lens of capital deepening and the role that it plays in labor productivity, is that this most recent period, 2017 to 2014, which is in the red bars of each of these set, that labor productivity growth has declined across all markets. The only one who's really bucking the trend is India, but all of them, the euro area, Japan, OECD, USA, all of them stepping down of labor productivity growth. With low labor productivity growth, the wherewithal to have growth overall in the economy, labor productivity growth being an indicator of GDP per capita, that metric of well-being, the underpinnings of that is deteriorating. And this is a case where Sweden does not look good. The drop down in labor productivity growth in Sweden is more dramatic than for other countries, and if we think about this as being, the seed corn for the next generation of the capacity of the Swedish economy to really make good on the commitments to the citizens, having a drop down in the rate of growth of labor productivity that is this dramatic means that something needs to be done. And this is a role for policymakers. The other metric that we focused on a lot this year in the economic outlook and was also a key element of our ministerial summit was rising inequality. Now, good news and bad news for Sweden here as a comparator. Two ways of thinking about metrics on inequality. The first one is to look at, and Sweden's in the bar there, but for all of these countries, virtually every single one of them, labor productivity growth is higher than median wage. What that means is that even with the productivity growth that we see, the wages are not the same as the labor productivity growth, meaning some of the benefits of the work that's being done by labor ends up increasingly in capital share. So the fact that all of the diamonds are above the bars basically is a reflection or is another way of showing that capital share in GDP is rising. That there may be some good reasons for that, but over the long term, ultimately, if the fruits of work don't show up in the pocketbook, then we don't have a circular flow of income that's going to lead to a sustainable economy. Now, another way, a sort of more common way of measuring inequality is in terms of deciles. And this average picture, this is the average. So, if we want to get under the hood and look at what other things are happening to inequality, we want to look at the deciles. And on this regard, on this picture, there's good news and bad news again. So the solid lines are the lines for Sweden, and the dotted lines are the lines for the OECD. The good news is if we go back to 1990, income growth, real income, real disposable income, has risen much faster for Sweden than for the OECD as a whole. So dramatic improvements in income for Sweden across all deciles. So that's the good news. And in fact, Sweden, on all deciles, bucked the trend in the OECD of declining income at the lower, at all levels. The bad news is the widening distribution between the rate of growth of income of the top 10 versus the bottom 10. This is the median. Does it matter that there's a rising gap if everybody's income is rising so quickly? That's a question. Some societies, it's okay if all the boats rise. In other society, the boats have to rise by kind of the same amount in order to retain social cohesion. There's not, I don't have an answer for this because this is very much a question for individual societies. We have another whole project that looks at societal aversion to inequality. And we know that societal aversion to inequality differs dramatically. And so I can't answer that question about whether that's okay or not. Only you can. So what are we going to do in order to move towards policies for sustainable growth, to get us out of this low growth equilibrium? And as I said, we can't keep our promises. Well, what do I mean by that? We have made promises to the young people that they will have a job, that will generate a career path, and they can move forward with their lives. In the OECD as a whole, 2.5 percentage points more youth are unemployed now than were unemployed in the 2006. So for those youth who are unemployed now and have been unemployed over the last 10 years, basically 10 years, they will have permanent scars to their income, because that's what we know about the first 10 years of working life, is if you do not have a job or you do not advance in a job in the first 10 years, you are permanently scarred in terms of your total income. So we've already broken promises to those people. It's also the case that 3% rate of growth is insufficient to make good on our promises to the old people, meaning pensions and health care. In fact, if we look at our situation with retirement, a defined benefit, 40 years ago, 40 years of savings, for somebody who retired in 2000, they would have twice as much to their retirement account as somebody who retired in 2016. So what's happened in terms of the rate of growth of the global economy and the policies associated with that over the last 15 or 20 years has dramatic implications for making good on promises. So what do we do on policies? Well, moving quickly, because I know I only have 2 minutes left based on my phone here telling me that. We've got to deal with a three-pronged policy strategy: fiscal policy, monetary policy, structural policies. Now, Sweden is on the right path in terms of its demand management policies, undertaking a fiscal expansion. This is a good thing. Now is a great time for governments to borrow. Why? Because look at what your central bank has done for you. It's created a situation where the interest rates that governments can borrow on are negative in some cases. In all cases, they're extremely low. If you're going to borrow, now is the time to do it. And Sweden, along with a couple of other countries, are in the process of doing that and engaging in the kinds of investments that are necessary to underpin the growth rate going forward. I think I'll skip that. Now on the structural side, I'm going to look at a couple of elements. There are bright spots for Sweden, but also challenges. So here is this investment picture that I was showing you, was telling you about. Here's the euro area. dramatic declines in investment. Sweden is doing much better, and their comparator here is the United States, because that's also one of the few countries that actually has private investment rising. So pretty good on that one. In terms of productivity growth, this is hot off the press new data, and I don't have it for Sweden, but I would suggest that Sweden should look at this. We are curious as to why productivity growth is so low. And I showed you for Sweden that it was particularly low and had dramatically fallen over the period. So we take a whole sample of industry of firms, and we put them all into industry sectors, and we ask the question, let's divide those firms up by which are the most productive, and then everybody else. So the most productive we can define two different ways: the top 5% of the firms in each sector, and the top 100 firms in each sector. So this is a global, and then everybody else. And so you can see that innovation, was doing pretty well, except for the financial crisis period. So those who are on the frontier firms that are innovating, continue to innovate just fine. But everybody else basically is not absorbing the innovations that are available. So why is it that firms that are out there don't grab innovation, from the fruits of the innovation tree? What stands in their way? It's very different for different countries, and we can talk about what the issues are facing Sweden, but it has to do with entry and exits of firms. It has to do with the extent to which there is business R&D and university collaboration. It has to do with labor market flexibility and reallocation. So challenges across the board, and we can look at Sweden on each one of those metrics in order to try to get at what might be holding the average Swedish firm back in comparison to the frontier Swedish firm. Now, I said this is global, but this could be done in the Swedish context. The second piece of the puzzle, beyond what firms do, is, of course, labor skills. And this is where we have a big challenge facing Sweden. PISA, is the young people's score, and this is the adult scores, the PIAC. I think everybody's nodding, they're familiar with that. So for these waves of PISAs and then their comparator PIACs, things look pretty good here up until where we are, the most recent one, which things don't look good anymore. Not only is PISA doesn't look good, but PIAC looks even worse. So of that particular age cohort. So PIAC looks okay if you're kind of middle-aged, but PIAC does not look okay if you're young. So this, again, gets back to the young people really being left behind in the last decade. So that's one challenge. What about these young people? The second challenge is the immigration challenge, where the asylum seekers in the blue line has really taken over in terms of comparisons to the other types of migrants. Now let's look at what policies and what policies have the consequences of policies. So this is, again, looking at PIAC. So we're looking at PIAC skill levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we're looking at the wages for each skill level for that PIAC age groups, mean hourly wages. Here's wages, here's unemployment. A couple different things going on in this chart. One is the tilt of Sweden relative to the OECD average. The tilt tells you something about wage similarities, wage dispersion across skills. Okay. The gaps on the horizontal axis tells you something about employment rates given wages and skills. So what if one of your objectives is wage tightness, not too much dispersion? Well, then this is great. Having not much of a tilt is a very good thing. If, on the other hand, one of your objectives is to raise the employment rates of people at the low skill levels, well, that's not working. There's a trade-off. High skill levels, high wage levels for low skills, the implication of that is a sacrifice ratio of 7 percentage points on employment rates. Is that a sacrifice ratio that is okay? or not? I can't answer it, but I can say it's very different from what the OECD average looks like. You get a benefit over at this end. High skills, the employment rate, if we come down here, is much higher. So is there a trade that can be made between the high and the low? I'm not going to make that judgment. I'm just going to say that comparisons like this can be useful for framing the discussion. Last slide, skill matching and labor mobility. Okay, skill matching turns out to be very important for labor productivity. The skill matching for Sweden is relatively good in comparison to some of our other countries. Let me look at my note here because I don't remember the number. About 20% of our PAC representatives believe, or we have a metric that says that 20% of the labor market in Sweden is mismatched for their job. Usually it's overskilled, but not necessarily. So 20% of the workers are mismatched. How much would productivity growth increase if we matched better people to their jobs, skills to their jobs? According to our estimates of our exercise, you would have an increase of about 7% on productivity levels if you were able to get better skill matching. Now, everybody always says, oh, that means we need to train more. I'm not going to disagree. On the other hand, there are other ways of getting at skill matching and the probability of getting skill matching or mismatching. And one of them, as it turns out, is mobility. A key element of mobility is housing. And on this regard, Sweden does not do well. If you need to go to a different place to get a match to your job that would increase productivity growth, and by the way, also increase your wages, and you need a rental apartment, you have to wait for 8 years. So that's a problem, because that's generally longer than the time horizon that somebody's going to be thinking about. And of course, the other problem is housing prices. So against these two ways of thinking about how the housing market affects skill matching and how skill matching affects productivity and how productivity affects the ability of the economy to make good on its promises, well then we find this to be, the crux of a big problem. So it's not the only thing, but I think it's a very important thing to consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Please stay on stage and we'll take a couple of questions. Thank you very much for this presentation. Now, you said challenges concerning the labor market, big challenge, most obvious challenges there. Productivity, a big drop in labor productivity, that's a big challenge, and the housing situation, of course. These are areas that OECD has already talked about as challenges for Sweden for quite some time now. Yep. Are we not listening to?
Well, that's a judgment that somebody else would like to make. We present issues. So what I would say is, yes, we've been pointing these things out for a while, but the environment in which we have made these suggestions has become much more challenging. In other words, labor markets were always an issue, but now you have a generation that has, from the PISA PIAC scores for the young people, that generation has not transformed itself the way previous generations did. And there's a new set of refugees and migrants. So the labor market situation, if it was sort of a problem before, it really has to be addressed now. Housing, yes, we've talked about it for a while, sort of macroprudential vulnerabilities. But we're talking about the housing market now, not so much from the macroprudential, macroeconomic vulnerability point of view, but we're looking at the housing market as an integral part of this labor market problem and productivity and inequality.
So you link the housing market to the labor.
So it's much more, rather than saying, well, we're worried about housing because we think the banks are going to go bust, we're looking at housing because we see that as a critical element of the set of labor market and productivity issues that are central to Sweden being able to move forward the way it wants to move forward in its approach to interaction with the citizens.
So very big challenges, even bigger challenges now than
Yes.
before concerning
Yeah.
the labor market. In
Yeah.
Sweden nowadays we are talking a lot about the kind of jobs that need or don't need lower start
Right.
wages.
Right.
What's your opinion?
Well, I pointed out that there's a basic fact about the labor market, and that is downward sloping demand curves. High wages tends to be associated with lower employment levels. But
That's
high
your
wages,
answer.
high wages is something that you want. Employment levels are something that you want. So policy has to think about how do we bring those two things together. And I know that we were discussing on the boat on the way over here, looking at all these other ways of breaking that conundrum, wanting to have the wage profile being respectful of the Swedish model, while at the same time ensuring that people who are at the low skill level get to fully participate in Sweden.
It is a very
Right?
tricky question. Did you have any advice for us?
I think that there were a number of suggestions there.
I know there are a number of suggestions.
So
which will come up.
we talk about. I mean, the way I often look at these things is making the analogy between labor and capital. We give companies subsidies all the time for capital, R&D tax credits, capital investment tax credits to buy IT. So it's time for a human capital investment tax credit in the young.
We'll bring that with us because this is a big thing of what we're going to discuss
Yeah.
later. Now you mentioned Brexit. You said we can talk about Brexit or we cannot talk about Brexit, but just a short word on Brexit. What would be the consequences for the European economy?
Well, conveniently.
It's not a very small question, I just realized, but
if you can turn the slide, if you can turn the computer back on, this is where we are in terms of our Brexit scenarios. On the left-hand side is the longer-term consequences for the United Kingdom and the European Union going out to 2023. For the European Union, it's about a little bit more than a percentage point. If we just look at financial shocks, because we think in the near term most of the consequences of Brexit come through volatility in the financial markets and the consequences of that for consumer confidence and consumer spending. The way we parameterize it is on the right-hand panel. And I circle the box EEA moderate because this is the group, moderate meaning Sweden has intermediate linkages to the UK through financial markets and through confidence channels as compared to, for example, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Switzerland that have much tighter connections, and they would be in the EEA high. So you get about a quarter of a percentage point cost loss of GDP coming from the UK shock itself, and then the percolation of the shock around the European Union, right? Because it's a shock that kind of comes, it doesn't just hit the water and go out. It actually comes back. It's a small pond, right? The rock hits the middle, goes out, and then it comes back. And so if we add that all up, it's you lose about 1.1 percentage points of GDP over the next couple of years.
So you call it a shock. That's pretty much a very clear answer to my question.
Yes.
Did you have questions for Catherine Mann? Yes. Let's give Max a microphone as well. It's for the webcast, so we need.
Which slide was it? Yes. Okay.
Firms there, were they most productive at the beginning of the period or at the end of the period?
So we've looked at this both in terms of following the same firms over the entire period, as well as changing who the frontier firms are. And the picture with regard to diffusion is the same. In other words, there's this big gap between the frontier firms, whether it's a rolling sample of different hundreds, different 100 firms, or not a rolling sample. So there is some change, and we don't know. I can't answer you that on the 5%, because as I say, I literally, we really wanted to use this picture to bring home the issues about productivity, and our previous sample had gone through 2009, which is like gazillion years of ancient history. And so we have much more research to do to evaluate the 100 firms and the 5%, and how much those who stay at are the ones at the frontier stay at the frontier. Because we are very concerned that the firms at the frontier stay there because they are either protected, or either by regulation, or they are protected by intellectual property protection, and those are both bad, or do they stay at the frontier because they're just really good, and not only do they look forward, but they look back in the rearview mirror and they see other firms coming up behind them, and they keep innovating.
So you don't really have an answer to that?
We don't have an answer to that now. We don't have an answer to that now. But those are two very different scenarios about the frontier. The frontier firms that stay there because they are always watching their back and constantly innovating, that's good. We do not want to prevent those firms from doing that. If the frontier firms are there because one way or another they have a privileged environment, well, we don't want to support that.
We have another question here, Lars.
Catherine Mann, I think you are making the same mistake as OECD did in 1988, 1989. You underestimate the impact of a credit-driven boom. And basically we have in Sweden, you describe it as a bright spot, but I'm afraid that this is just a brightness created by the very expansionary monetary policy. Booming asset prices, booming credit, and maybe most likely a crash after this. So my question is, why are you doing the same mistake as you did last time you had a financial crisis? Why can't you get asset prices, wealth into your picture?
I think I put asset prices in my picture. The lens of the increase in asset prices and the rental rates in my picture those are damaging for productivity growth, for skill matching, for ability of labor to move around the economy. And ultimately, that has longer term implications than even a crash of the asset valuation. I mean, I would say that, asset valuations are important. Macroeconomic policy is obviously critically important. But if we can't get labor to move around the economy, then the economy does not have the resilience to be able to respond flexibly to the crash when it comes.
But we're not driving towards a crash by being so expansionary.
The picture that I would look at for that is looking at this picture about investment. This is not just housing investment, this is also business investment. And in fact, because I've looked at this, I've been in Sweden here before last year, and this is just an update of that slide. And I asked the question at that time, how much is this Swedish line, which looks pretty good in terms of investment, how much of that is just driven by housing? And the answer is not that much. And so Sweden is getting benefits of business investment, a lot of knowledge-based capital, which of course is the foundation of today's kind of productivity growth going forward. So the lower interest rates and the loose monetary policy in Sweden is supportive of this kind of good investment, even as it also has some consequences for asset prices. So I think what we're saying is that macro policy has, as with all policies, there's the costs and then there are the benefits. And weighing those two is a critical ingredient for every decision that policymakers make. No policy is without some downsides. It's always a balance. And I think in the context, for example, of the labor market, I already pointed out there's a balance. that has to be struck in terms of what happen in the labor market in Sweden.
We have one more question, please.
Just before my questions, I want to make a comment on the first questions about that we don't know everything about these growth firms. There are some studies in Sweden on Circle Entrepreneurial School in southern Sweden, and they studied 1,000 gazelle companies, and they compare them with other companies, and they could see that 1% of the firm stands for 50% of the growth. But I couldn't find any common cause of this. More than only one common denominator is that they worked a lot with their internal processes. It has nothing to do with innovation or knowledge company. It's working with their internal competence.
Yep.
These firms are better to do that.
Yep.
But now over to my question. Are you measuring the right things? Because there was an article in Economist this spring questioning if GDP is really a good indicator of the economical turnover when we approach the information society. Because there are so many other factors going around, and that they kind of decouple from this indicator. And there are scientists, for example, Jürgen Randers, who are foreseeing that when you move into an information society, according to the traditional way of measuring labor productivity, it will slow down. Could these bad figures for Sweden be a sign that we are really ahead?
So this is another big question. Is GDP a good measurement for?
Every time that there is a significant technological innovation, we are faced with this question about whether or not we are measuring the right things, whether or not we're missing beneficial issues. Of course, we also have the question about, are we missing bad things? Like, we didn't measure pollution, right? So GDP as a metric has always been under question. The issue is are we so badly measuring things as to do different policies? In other words, are we being misguided by so much that we would do something different?
And do you think we are?
And this is where I say no. I'm sure that there's mismeasurement. I don't doubt it for a minute. But that's why you go below the hood and you start looking at a lot of individual elements. You look at how certain markets are working. You look at labor mobility and these firms, and you get further and further down in the detail to make sure that you're doing the right thing from a policy perspective. You cannot make policies by only looking at GDP or only looking at labor productivity. Those are too aggregate.
So what you're saying is that even if we are measuring not exactly the right things, we are still doing the right things.
Yes.
Yes. So
we have enough information. We do have enough information to guide policy. Whether or not we do that policy, well, that's another matter.
That's up to the government. We're going to talk about that in just a while. Last question to you. Your general director said, I think this was a couple of years ago, he said that the Swedish economy is like Pippi Långstrump. Is that still the case?
I guess it is.
Professor Catherine Mann, thank you very much for
you very
coming.
much.